Hi, I'm John Kursky, and in part 2 of making you an AI-enabled Power BI tester, I'm going to explain some of the naming conventions when building tests, as well as show you how to build tests for DAX measures. All right, so before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel so you can stay up to date on all the new features and content we'll be putting out on this channel over the next couple of weeks. And with that, in part 1, we went over how to incorporate PQL.Assert into your semantic model so that you can build tests. But today, I'd like to get you more familiar with the naming conventions for the test and show you a neat trick on how do you build tests for DAX measures. So up on the screen here, I've got the example test that we built in our last video. And keep in mind, I will have a link to this in the YouTube description so you can download this file and use it and work with it after this video. One of the things that you may have noticed is, if I can zoom in here, is there is a suffix here. We've got this .any and .tests. Now the reason we do this is we want to provide some sort of tag or mnemonic that allows our automated testing and later on our AI to pick up on which environment do we want to run these tests in. And when we talk about why do we want to look at the environments, let's go to the documentation real quickly. Now, in the documentation for PQL.Assert, we introduce kind of some naming conventions that we like to use on our projects. Now, you're free to name this however you feel, and the way we built the functions is that you can retrieve any sort of naming convention. One of the things you do want to keep in mind is we pick dev, test, prod, and any, is because at the time of this video, these were not reserved words in DAX. If you do try to use something like all, that will not work because all is a function in DAX. So we kept with this kind of naming convention. And when we looked at it, for development, we want to do testing on very narrow windows or parameterized data. So what do I mean by that? Well, in a dev environment, I can control the underlying data. So when I have a DAX measure and I want to calculate revenue, I can look at a very specific period of time, maybe a fiscal year, and know that if my DAX measure is adding up to 1 million, then my underlying data is good and my DAX measure is good. If it doesn't meet that criteria, either I've added in some filters or changed the underlying data that is making that measure not calculate that meets my expectations. So when you are building a test, you kind of know what the data is. So I like to build tests for DAX measures in my dev environment. Then when we move to test in production, this is when we start expanding and more generalizing the tests, where maybe we're looking at content and schema validation. When we refresh the data, did those columns stay distinct? Do we have all the tables hydrated? In prod, do we want to make sure that one column that we know has a tendency to have null values doesn't go above a certain threshold? These are the kind of things that maybe in dev, we understand the data and there's not a lot of surprises because it's static. But as we move to test and production, we want to make sure that all of our logic in Power Query and DAX is well tested, or at least we're monitoring for any changes if the underlying data has changed, because we don't always control the underlying data and maybe there's some surprises, so we want to test for that. So in general, what we've kind of put in this table is what you should be doing. I like to test calculations in my dev environment, and then when I'm looking at testing content and schema, I will expand that to the rest of the environments or my teams will. Now, if you follow this naming convention, it's a lot easier for your teams to be able to distinguish those environments. It's going to be easy for AI to distinguish that. And in the next video, when I show you how to use Power Automate to run these tests, it's very easy to have Power Automate have a kind of a branch to pick, oh, is this dev, is this test, is this prod? How do I run these tests? So with that, kind of explaining the naming conventions out of the way, let's talk about building tests for DAX measures. So I'm going to go back to the screen here, and I am going to show you a nice little trick that I love to do with Performance Analyzer. Now, I will admit I am not an expert in DAX. Not very many people in this world are, but you can leverage Power BI to build the DAX for you. So what do I mean by that? So what I like to do is I'll go to the report view, and let me just open a new tab real quickly. Close this out so I can start fresh. And what I will do is create a card. And a card just on a blank window is a very simple way that I could test the DAX measure. And I'm going to drag over this number of characters field. Now, for the purpose of this demo, I am going to go ahead and just update it and remove the +0 out of here so we can show you kind of how that works. Now, I have this one visual up on here. Now, what I can do is if I go to View up at the top here and use Performance Analyzer, I can actually add in filters. So let me add in a filter. I'm going to set it for good. And let me add a date filter. I'm going to set it here. So under this condition, good, and for this date, I've got a blank. Now, normally I don't like showing a number blank, and this is what I want to test for. But how do I build the DAX for this certain condition? Because the underlying data is static and I'm in my dev environment. How do I build or understand what the DAX is to test for this condition? Well, if I go to Performance Analyzer, click on that and expand, I'm going to clear here. I can refresh the visuals. And since there's only one visual on here, it's going to keep track of all the changes that's been made. And I can run this in DAX Query View. Now, in DAX Query View, I've got the filter for good, I've got the filter for the date that I added, and ultimately the output. Now, what I can do with that is I can copy this over to kind of the template I have for building tests. Now, notice that in here, I've already called it that file name, and I've got example.dev.test because I'm doing it in the dev environment. Just so that we're clear, I'm going to make sure that we're sticking with some naming standards here. And now that I have this template, right now it's just outputting a table. I want to have it consistent using PQL.Assert. So what I'm going to do, get rid of this real quick, and paste in the content here. Now, why would I want to do that? Well, in order for the function to be able to operate, I need to be able to establish the filters within the body of the function so it maintains the context. And since I want to store what that value is, I'm going to call that test1 is equal to that. Now, at this point, this function is only not actually working. What I now want to do is build out the tests. And so what I'm going to do here is return PQL.Assert should not be null, should not be null or blank. And I'm going to say number of characters should not be blank or null. All right, and then I will reference the test. And at this point, hopefully, if I run this, you'll notice that the test failed because under this condition right now, it's showing blank. Well, if I fix the DAX measure, go back to the report, get a number of characters, get a +0. Now that's saved, I'll go back to the DAX measure, and the test has passed. Now, under that condition, I'm using Performance Analyzer to help me build these tests. Now, one of the things I also like to do is as I'm going to integrate more tests into the code or into the test cases is I'll update the variable name. So I'll highlight this and hit Control F on the screen, and I can do something like good filter. And so that way I've got it's set up to do certain naming conventions, and I think I overwrit the date filter as well. So I will make sure that that's not overwritten. Again, nice thing is when I show you AI, a lot of this stuff can help with some of these syntax mistakes. So now I've got it where that's the good filter, the date filter, test 1, and it's a little more straightforward. Again, when I run the test, we're good. Now, you will notice here that up at the top in DAX Query View, I haven't added it to the model. So when I'm good with the function or the test, I want to update the model and add that in there. Right now, if you don't hit that, if I close the file out, it will get stored in DAX Query View, but it won't be part of the model. So if we want to execute this remotely, it won't work. All right, so how do I incorporate a second test? Well, let's say I want to remove that date filter. And under this condition, I want to always make sure that it's the number of characters 4636. Very similar if you're working with financial data, maybe a certain quarter 2 years ago, under certain conditions, always equals this amount. And if it doesn't, then either you made a mistake in your upstream data or your Power Query, or somebody has messed with the DAX measure and it's not calculating correctly anymore. This is why you want to test that, especially if you've run into this issue before. One of the things I always tell folks is you don't just build tests for test's sake. If you run into an issue, build a test. All right, so I'm going to go back to the DAX Query View here. I'm sorry. I'm going to clear and hit refresh on the Performance Analyzer, hit Run in DAX Query View, and then since I already have that good filter, I'm just going to copy this. Now you can clean up Query 1 and Query 2 later, but I'll do that after this video is concluded. And now I'm going to add to this the second test and get rid of evaluate, test 2, set that equal, and make sure that that says good filter. And make sure we're here. You can always use the format up at the top as well if you want to prettify it later. Now, I'm returning just one test right now. If I want to return 2 tests, I am just going to add union, the union function. And at the end of this, I'm going to hit Alt-Enter again and do PQL.Assert should, if I can spell right, equals, and say number of good align characters is 4636. And the expected is the hard-coded value. And now I can reference test 2 and close the parentheses. And let's just make sure this should run now. Yep, okay. So now expected value is 4636, actual value is 4636, and now it has passed. And then I want to overwrite that function, update the model, and now I have this set of test cases in the model that I can run. All right, so I hope you learned something today. We went over the naming conventions for tests, as well as showed you how to use Performance Analyzer to build tests for DAX measures. Now in our next video, I'm going to show you, now that we have those tests in the model, how we can leverage Power Automate to actually execute these tests. So you don't need any external tools outside the Power Platform. You can actually run these tests in Power Automate, which is really helpful if you're running an environment that doesn't allow third-party tools and you have to keep within the Power Platform ecosystem. So with that, till the next video, take care.